They paid me $38,000 a year to sit in the corner and stay invisible, while my sister walked into the same company with a $300,000 contract and a future already written for her. And for years, I told myself that was just how things worked in our family, until the night they stood on a stage in front of 400 guests and made it official that I didn't matter. But what they didn't know was that someone in that room had been waiting for that exact moment to hand me an envelope that would instantly make me the most powerful person in the company. My name is Lena Carter. I'm 28 years old, and I was born into a family where success was not just expected. It was displayed like a trophy, polished and presented to the world through our company, Carter Holdings, a real estate empire my grandfather built from a single office and turned into a name that carried weight across the city. The kind of name people recognized on building plaques and charity galas. The kind of name that opened doors before you even knocked. But inside that family, inside those walls, I was never part of that legacy. Not really. Because from the time I was a child, I was labeled as the one who didn't quite measure up, the one who was slower, quieter, less impressive than everyone else, especially my older sister Vanessa, who seemed to collect achievements as easily as breathing, and somewhere along the way, that label became my role, something everyone accepted without question, including me. At family events, the difference was always subtle enough to be denied, but obvious enough to be felt. I was never excluded outright, but I was always placed just far enough from the center to remind me where I stood, seated at the edge of long tables during formal dinners, introduced as Lena, with no accomplishments attached, while Vanessa's name came with a list of credentials. And when conversations shifted toward business, investments, or future plans, I learned early to stay quiet because no one expected me to contribute, and no one waited for me to speak. And over time, that silence became something I carried with me, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood that in that room, my voice didn't change anything. When I started working at Carter Holdings after college, I told myself things would be different. That being inside the company would finally give me a chance to prove I belonged. But instead, it only made the divide clearer. I was given a position that required no decision-making, no responsibility beyond simple tasks, filing documents, scheduling meetings, preparing materials for discussions I was never invited to attend, while Vanessa stepped directly into a leadership role, attending strategy sessions, speaking with executives, being groomed for something bigger. And every time I passed a conference room with the door closed and heard voices discussing deals worth millions, I reminded myself that I was lucky to be there at all, even though a part of me knew that luck had nothing to do with it. The smallest moments were the ones that stayed with me. The way people would lower their voices when I entered a room, assuming I wouldn't understand what they were discussing. The way my suggestions were acknowledged with polite smiles but never acted on. The way I was asked to take notes instead of share ideas, and it wasn't one single incident that defined my place in the family or the company. It was the accumulation of all of them, the quiet, consistent message that I was not someone to be taken seriously. And over time, that message became something I stopped questioning, something I learned to live with. Because in a family like mine, acceptance wasn't something you earned by trying harder. It was something that was decided long before you ever had a chance to prove yourself. When I signed my contract at Carter Holdings, the number at the bottom was $38,000 a year, and I remember staring at it longer than I should have, trying to convince myself it was just a starting point, that everyone began somewhere, that this was temporary. But that same week, Vanessa's compensation package was announced internally, $300,000 a year with bonuses tied to performance, and a clear path into executive leadership, and no one tried to hide the difference or explain it. It was treated as natural, expected, as if the gap between us reflected something obvious that didn't need to be said out loud. And for a while, I believed that too. I told myself she had earned it, that she was simply better prepared, better educated, more capable in ways I wasn't. But the longer I stayed, the more I began to notice things that didn't fit that narrative. I watched how decisions were made, who was invited into rooms and who wasn't, how opportunities appeared for some people and quietly disappeared for others. And I started to see that my role had been decided long before I ever walked into that building. Because every time I showed initiative, every time I tried to take on more responsibility, it was redirected or dismissed with a calm, almost rehearsed response, that it wasn't the right time, that I should focus on my current tasks, that there would be opportunities later, and later never came. While Vanessa was handed projects, clients, and visibility without having to ask, and it became clear that this wasn't about capability at all. It was about control, about keeping me exactly where I was, because that version of me was easier to manage, easier to explain, easier to ignore. The realization didn't come all at once. It built slowly, through small patterns that became impossible to unsee. The way my name was left off internal communications, nay, the way my access to certain files was restricted without reason, the way my father would speak about future leadership, as if I wasn't even in the room, and the more I paid attention, the more I understood that I hadn't been overlooked. I had been deliberately placed in a position where I could never be seen as anything more. Not because I lacked the ability to grow, but because my growth would disrupt the story they had already decided to tell about me. The moment it became undeniable happened at the annual Carter Holdings Gala. 400 guests filling a ballroom designed to impress. Investors, partners, executives, all gathered to celebrate another year of success. And as always, my family took the stage to speak. My father at the center, confident and composed, thanking everyone for their support before shifting the focus to the future of the company. And when he spoke about Vanessa, his voice carried pride, certainty, a vision of what came next. But when his attention turned to me, everything changed in a way that was subtle enough to pass as harmless but sharp enough to cut through the room. He smiled, placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, and said, "Lena isn't really leadership material, but she's still family." And the audience responded with polite laughter, the kind that fills silence without questioning it. And in that moment, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not even embarrassment, but clarity, because it was no longer implied. It was no longer something I could explain away. It had been said out loud, in front of everyone who mattered, exactly who I was supposed to be. But that wasn't the worst part. The next morning, I noticed something small at first, something easy to dismiss. My inbox was quieter than usual. The daily internal update emails that everyone in the department received had stopped showing up. And when I checked the distribution list, my name was no longer there. I refreshed the page twice, thinking it was a mistake. But it wasn't. And when I asked IT about it, they gave me a vague answer about system adjustments. The kind of explanation that sounded official without actually explaining anything. And I nodded as if it made sense, even though I knew it didn't. Over the next few days, those small changes started to stack up in ways that were harder to ignore. Meeting invites I used to schedule were reassigned to someone else without any notice. Shared folders I had access to suddenly required permissions I no longer had, and conversations would stop the moment I walked into a room, followed by quick smiles and polite silence as if nothing had been said. And I didn't need anyone to tell me what was happening because I had seen this pattern before, not in a company, but in my own family. The slow, quiet way people removed you from the picture without ever having to say it directly. Then came the conversations I wasn't supposed to hear, voices through thin office walls. My name spoken in a tone that was clinical, detached, as if they were discussing a problem to be managed rather than a person. I heard one executive refer to me as a liability, not maliciously, not even angrily, just as a fact, something to account for, something to minimize. And what stayed with me wasn't the word itself. It was how easily it was accepted by everyone else in the room. No one questioned it. No one defended me. It simply became part of the narrative, another piece of the story that had been built around who I was supposed to be. Vanessa's role in all of this became clearer with each passing day. She didn't confront me directly. She didn't need to. Instead, she made decisions that quietly erased me from the process, assigning projects without including me, redirecting questions that once came to me to other people, positioning herself as the only point of contact for anything that mattered. And when I tried to step in, to offer input or even ask simple questions, she would respond with that same controlled politeness she used in public, telling me she had it handled, or that I should focus on my responsibilities. And the way she said it made it sound like she was helping me, protecting me from something I wasn't capable of handling. By the end of the week, I realized I was no longer part of the team in any meaningful way. I was still there physically, still completing tasks, still sitting at the same desk. But everything that connected me to the company's actual work had been cut off. And it happened so smoothly that if you weren't paying attention, you might not even notice it. But I did, because I was the one being removed piece by piece. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself why and started asking what they were preparing for. I got my answer on Friday afternoon when an email marked confidential appeared in my inbox. A message from HR requesting a private meeting the following week to discuss organizational changes, and I didn't need to open it to understand what it meant, because everything that had happened since the gala had been leading to this moment, the removal from emails, the reassignment of responsibilities, the quiet conversations behind closed doors. It wasn't random. It wasn't miscommunication. It was a process, deliberate and calculated. And as I sat there staring at the subject line, I understood something with a certainty I hadn't felt before. They weren't just pushing me aside anymore. They were getting ready to remove me completely. I opened the email slowly, even though I already knew what it would say. And as the words settled into place, the message became clear in a way that left no room for interpretation. My position was being eliminated, effective immediately. A short paragraph about restructuring. A brief mention of severance that sounded more like a formality than support. And a closing line thanking me for my contributions, as if the past few years could be summarized that easily. And for a moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen, not because I didn't understand what had happened, but because I finally understood that there had never been a place for me here to begin with. The practical reality hit me next. Not all at once, but in sharp, precise calculations. My rent, my bills, the balance in my account that I already knew was too low. The fact that I had no savings to fall back on because I had spent years earning just enough to get by. And the truth settled in with a weight that was impossible to ignore without this job. And I had maybe 2 months before everything collapsed, before I lost my apartment, before I had to start over with nothing. And for the first time, the fear wasn't about how my family saw me. It was about survival, about what happened when the little stability I had left disappeared. But even that wasn't what stayed with me the most. It was the realization that this had all been planned, that every step since the gala, every quiet removal, every conversation behind closed doors had led here, and I wasn't just being let go. I was being erased, removed from the company, from the narrative, from any version of the future they were building. And if I accepted it, If I walked away quietly like they expected me to, then everything they had ever said about me would become true simply because I had never challenged it. That night, I went back to the gala, not as part of the celebration, but because I hadn't left yet, because I had been standing on the edge of that room when everything started to shift, and as the music played and people continued to celebrate, I felt completely disconnected from it, like I was watching something that no longer had anything to do with me, and I was about to leave, to step out into the night and figure out what came next, when someone called my name from behind me. I turned and saw a man I didn't recognize, older, composed, holding himself with a kind of quiet authority that made people move out of his way without realizing it. He introduced himself as a lawyer, someone who had worked with my grandmother, and before I could ask why he was speaking to me, he handed me a sealed envelope, heavy in a way that felt deliberate, and said that he had been instructed to give it to me at a very specific moment, the moment my family made it clear exactly who they believed I was. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, at the weight of it, at the seal that hadn't been broken, and something shifted again. Not fear this time, but something else. Something I couldn't fully name yet, because whatever was inside that envelope had been waiting for me long before this night, long before the email, long before the moment my father stood on that stage and decided my place in front of everyone. And for the first time since I opened that message, I realized that maybe this wasn't the end of something. Maybe it was the beginning of something I hadn't been allowed to see until now. For most of my adult life, survival had never been about ambition. It had been about getting through each month without falling behind, my paycheck covering rent, basic expenses, and little else, and I learned to measure stability in small ways, whether I could pay everything on time, whether I had enough left for the next week, whether nothing unexpected happened that would push everything off balance. And while people around me talked about investments, promotions, and long-term plans, I focused on what was in front of me, because that was all I had been given room to do. Opportunities to grow had always been just out of reach, not because they didn't exist, but because I was never considered for them. Training programs, mentorship tracks, even basic professional development were offered to others as a natural next step, while for me, there was always a reason to wait, to stay where I was, sought to not push beyond what had already been decided, and after hearing no enough times, I stopped asking, not because I didn't want more, but because I understood that wanting it didn't change anything in the environment I was in. So I adapted in the only way I could, quietly and without anyone noticing. I built my own way of learning, not through traditional methods that had always been harder for me, but through patterns, diagrams, visual structures that allowed me to break down information into something I could actually process. And at first, it was just a way to keep up, to understand documents and conversations that moved too quickly for me otherwise. But over time, something shifted. I started to see connections others didn't point out, relationships between numbers, flows of information, the structure behind decisions that weren't obvious on the surface, and without realizing it, the thing that had once been treated as a limitation became something else entirely. I would listen to conversations in the hallway, fragments of deals being discussed, and later I would map them out in my own way, tracing how each part connected to the next, where risks might exist, where something didn't align, and I never shared these observations because no one had asked for them. But I noticed that when deals were reviewed later, the issues I had quietly identified were often the same ones that caused problems. And it was the first time I allowed myself to consider that maybe I wasn't lacking ability. Maybe I had simply been forced to develop it differently. But none of that seemed to matter when the email came, when the job disappeared, when everything I had built my life around was taken away in a single message, and as I sat alone that night, The weight of it all finally settled in. Not just the loss of income, but the loss of identity, of direction, of any connection to the future I had been trying to build. And the thought came quietly at first. Then, with more certainty, I thought everything was over. Not just the job, but the possibility that things could ever be different. I had lost the company. I had lost the family that had defined my place in the world, and whatever future I had imagined, however limited it was, had been erased along with everything else, and for a moment, there was nothing left to hold on to except the envelope still sitting unopened beside me, something I had almost forgotten in the middle of everything that had happened. When I finally reached for it, my hands were steady in a way I didn't expect, and as I broke the seal and began to read, the words came into focus slowly, but what they revealed changed everything. It wasn't just a document, it was a will, one that had never been shown, one that carried conditions I hadn't anticipated. And as I moved through the lines, one detail stood out with absolute clarity. I had 72 hours to act, to claim what had been left to me, or it would disappear completely, transferred away as if it had never been mine at all. And in that moment, the sense of finality I had felt just minutes before shifted into something else. Because this wasn't an ending, it was a narrow window, a single opportunity that would either redefine everything or confirm exactly what I had always been told about myself. I read the document again, slower this time, forcing myself to process every line, every clause, because it didn't feel real. It felt like something that belonged to a different version of my life, not the one I had been living up until that moment. And when I reached the section that outlined the actual inheritance, my breath caught in a way I couldn't control. 51% of Carter Holdings, a controlling share valued at $52 million. Not a symbolic gesture, not a small safety net, but ownership, authority, something that completely redefined my position in a company that had never allowed me to have one. For a moment, everything else faded, the email, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it replaced by a single, overwhelming realization that the narrative I had been living under, the one that said I didn't belong, that I wasn't capable, that I had no place in that world, had been challenged by someone who had seen something different in me long before I was able to see it in myself, and that someone had prepared for this moment with a level of precision that made it impossible to dismiss as coincidence. But as I continued reading, that initial sense of clarity shifted again, replaced by something more urgent, more demanding, because the inheritance wasn't automatic. It wasn't something that simply transferred into my hands the moment I opened the envelope. It came with a condition, one that required action, timing, and a level of decisiveness I had never been asked to demonstrate before. The will stated clearly that in order to activate the transfer of shares, I had to formally request an emergency board meeting within 72 hours, and if I failed to do so, if I hesitated or convinced myself to wait, the entire bequest would be void, redirected according to a previous document that would leave me with nothing. I lowered the pages and stared at the wall in front of me, trying to absorb what that actually meant. Because this wasn't just about accepting something that had been given to me. It was about stepping into a position that would force me to confront everything I had spent years avoiding. The board, the executives, my father, Vanessa. All of them would be there. All of them would have to acknowledge what the document represented. And for the first time, I wouldn't be standing at the edge of the room. I would be at the center of it. The weight of that realization settled in slowly, not as fear, but as a kind of pressure that demanded a decision. Because the 72-hour window didn't just limit my time, it removed my ability to stay passive, to wait for things to resolve on their own. It required me to act, to step forward in a way I never had before. And as I sat there holding the document, I understood that this wasn't just an opportunity, it was a test, not of whether I deserved what had been left to me, but of whether I was willing to claim it. I picked up my phone and looked at the business card the lawyer had given me, his name printed cleanly beneath the firm's logo, and for a moment I hesitated. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I understood exactly what would happen. Once I did it, there would be no going back to the version of my life where I stayed quiet, where I accepted my place without question. Because requesting that meeting would change everything, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever decided who I was supposed to be. I didn't tell anyone what I had found, not my coworkers, not my family, not even the few people who had occasionally shown me quiet kindness, because I understood that the moment I spoke about it without proof, it would be dismissed the same way everything else I had ever said had been dismissed. So instead, I kept it contained, focused, and deliberate, starting with the one person who could confirm that what I was holding was real, the lawyer whose name was printed on the card in my hand. He didn't waste time with reassurances or unnecessary explanations. He reviewed the document, confirmed its validity, and then shifted the conversation to what mattered most, the process. The requirement that I request an emergency board meeting, and more importantly, the fact that such a request would need support, not just a formal submission, but signatures from board members willing to stand behind it. And as he outlined the steps, the timeline, and the potential resistance I would face, it became clear that this wasn't just a legal action, it was a strategic one. Over the next 24 hours, I began reaching out, carefully and selectively, not to everyone, but to the people who had been mentioned in passing conversations, the ones who had shown hesitation in meetings, the ones who didn't always agree with my father but rarely challenged him openly. And each conversation followed a similar pattern: initial skepticism, polite distance, the assumption that I didn't have anything substantial to present. Because in their minds, I was still the same person I had always been, the administrative assistant with no influence and no access. The reactions didn't surprise me. Some didn't respond at all. Others listened just long enough to decline involvement, not out of hostility, but out of caution. Aligning themselves with my father had always been the safer choice, and I could hear it in their tone, the reluctance to engage with something that might disrupt the balance they had grown comfortable with. And for a moment, I wondered if they were right, if I was stepping into something I wasn't prepared to handle, if this was exactly the kind of situation my family had always said I couldn't manage. At the same time, inside the company, the narrative around me hadn't changed. If anything, it had become more dismissive. I heard my name mentioned in passing conversations, described as someone who was overreacting or causing unnecessary disruption. And when I crossed paths with Vanessa, her expression carried a controlled patience, as if she were dealing with something temporary that would resolve itself once I ran out of momentum, and it became clear that whatever I was doing behind the scenes, it wasn't being taken seriously. Not by her, not by my father, not by anyone who had already decided what I was capable of. But I kept going, not because I was certain it would work, but because the alternative was to do nothing, to let the 72 hours pass and confirm every assumption that had ever been made about me. And then something shifted. Small at first. One board member agreed to review the document more closely. Another asked a question that went beyond polite dismissal, and the conversations that followed became more focused, less about whether I should be doing this, and more about what the document actually meant if it was valid. By the second day, the resistance had started to crack, in ways that weren't visible on the surface but were clear in the details. A willingness to listen, to consider, to engage with the possibility that something significant was unfolding. And when the third signature came through, formal and documented, it didn't feel like a victory in the way I had imagined it might. There was no sense of triumph, no moment of celebration, just a quiet, steady understanding that the process had moved forward, that the meeting would happen, and that for the first time, I had done something that couldn't be undone or ignored. While I looked at the confirmed request, at the names attached to it, and realized that the part no one had believed in, the part they had dismissed as noise, had just become something real, something that would force them to pay attention whether they wanted to or not. And as I set everything in place for what came next, I understood that this was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It was about following through on a decision I had already made, regardless of how anyone else chose to see it. The morning of the meeting, I arrived earlier than I needed to, standing in the lobby of Carter Tower with the kind of stillness that comes when everything has already been decided internally. Even if nothing has happened yet on the outside, the building looked the same as it always did. Polished glass, quiet efficiency, people moving with purpose. But for me, it felt different. Because for the first time, I wasn't walking in as someone passing through. I was walking in with something that would change the structure of everything inside it. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was silent. Just the soft hum of movement and the reflection of myself in the mirrored walls, dressed simply. Nothing that marked me as important or powerful. And for a moment, I thought about how many times I had taken that same elevator and stepped out into a space where I didn't belong, where I stayed close to the edges and kept my presence small, and how different this moment was, even though nothing about my appearance had changed. When the doors opened, the boardroom hallway was already active, assistants moving quickly, voices low but focused, and at the far end, the double doors to the boardroom stood closed, guarded by a member of security who stepped forward the moment I approached, his expression neutral but firm as he asked for my name and checked the list in front of him. And when he looked back up, there was no hesitation in his response. I wasn't on the authorized list, and he couldn't let me through. For a brief second, the old instinct surfaced, the one that told me to step back, to accept the boundary without question, to assume that if I wasn't included, there must be a reason. But this time, that instinct didn't hold, because I knew something he didn't, something the people inside that room didn't fully understand yet, and I stayed where I was, explaining calmly that I had business with the board, that I had been part of the request for this meeting, but the response didn't change. Policy was policy, and without authorization, the door remained closed. I became aware of movement behind me, the shift in attention as people passing through the hallway slowed slightly, recognizing me but not intervening. And then I heard her voice, Vanessa, controlled, composed, asking what the issue was. And when she saw me, her expression tightened just enough to reveal that this wasn't unexpected. That whatever she thought I was doing, she had already decided it didn't matter. She stepped closer, speaking in that same measured tone she used in meetings, explaining to security that I didn't need to be there, that anything I thought I had to say could be addressed another time, and for a moment, it looked like that would be the end of it. Then another voice cut through the conversation, calm but unmistakable. Coming from the direction of the boardroom doors as one of the members stepped forward, someone who had signed the request, someone who had seen the document, and without raising his voice or making a scene, he simply stated that I had been invited to speak, that I had standing to be in the room, and that I would be allowed inside. And the authority in his words was enough to shift the situation instantly. The hesitation from security, the brief pause from Vanessa, the quiet recalibration of everyone watching. The doors opened, not dramatically, not with any visible acknowledgement of what was about to happen, just a simple movement that created space where there had been none a moment before. And as I stepped past the threshold into the boardroom, I felt the weight of every eye in the room turn toward me, not with recognition, not yet, but with curiosity, with the expectation that this was a minor interruption that would be resolved quickly. I took my seat at the far end of the table, the same position I had always been given, but this time it didn't feel like a limitation. It felt like the starting point of something else entirely. And as the meeting began, as the formalities moved forward, as the structure of the conversation settled into place, I looked around at the people who had never considered me part of their world and understood something with complete clarity. They didn't know I was about to take control. The meeting moved forward the way these meetings always did, structured, controlled, guided by people who were used to being in charge of the outcome. My father at the head of the table, composed and confident, Vanessa seated beside him, already speaking as if her future role had been secured. And for a few minutes, no one acknowledged why I was there, as if ignoring me would return everything to normal. But eventually, the attention shifted. One of the board members who had supported the request cleared his throat and redirected the room, stating that there was a matter that needed to be addressed before anything else could continue. My father responded immediately, his tone calm but firm, framing the situation as a misunderstanding, suggesting that whatever I thought I had discovered could be reviewed later, privately, without disrupting the meeting. And Vanessa added to that, her voice measured, reinforcing the idea that this was unnecessary, that I didn't have the experience or the context to present anything of real significance, and for a moment, it felt like the same pattern repeating itself, the same quiet dismissal, the same assumption that my presence didn't carry weight. Then the lawyer stood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't attempt to control the room. He simply introduced himself, stated his role, and placed the document on the table in front of the chairman. And the shift was immediate. Not dramatic, but undeniable. The kind of change that happens when something enters a space that cannot be ignored. The chairman adjusted his posture, glanced down at the pages, and for the first time, the conversation slowed. "This document is valid," the lawyer said, his tone precise, measured, leaving no room for interpretation, and then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch longer than it actually was, he continued. "Lena Carter now holds 51% of Carter Holdings." The room went completely still. No one spoke, no one moved, the silence settling in with a weight that made every small sound feel amplified, and I could feel the shift without looking, the way attention moved, the way assumptions collapsed in real time. And when I finally lifted my gaze, I saw it clearly. My father no longer leaning back with controlled confidence, but frozen, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and recognition, as if he were trying to reconcile what he had just heard with everything he thought he knew. Vanessa reacted differently, the composure she had maintained until that moment breaking in a way that was subtle but visible, her posture tightening, her focus shifting rapidly between the document and the people around the table. Searching for confirmation that this was a mistake, something that could be corrected, explained away, dismissed, but no one stepped in to do that. Because the statement hadn't come from me, it had come from someone whose authority in that room carried weight. The validation didn't stop there. The chairman requested confirmation, not out of doubt, but out of process. And the lawyer provided it, outlining the execution of the will, the legal framework that governed it, the fact that it had been properly filed, witnessed, and protected. And as he spoke, the board's legal counsel began reviewing the document independently, checking records, verifying details, each step reinforcing the same conclusion from a different angle, until it was no longer a claim, but a fact supported by multiple layers of authority. By the time the chairman looked up again, the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The balance of power no longer resting where it had just minutes before. And when he spoke, his words reflected that shift with a clarity that didn't need emphasis. The will was legally binding, the transfer of shares valid under inheritance law, and effective immediately. I was no longer someone observing from the edge of the room. I was the majority shareholder of the company everyone else was there to manage. No one laughed this time. No one dismissed it. And for the first time, there was nothing anyone could say to reduce what had just been made undeniable. For a moment after the confirmation, no one moved, as if the room itself needed time to adjust to what had just been said. And then the reactions began, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, unmistakable shifts, the kind that reveal more than words ever could. My father straightened in his chair, attempting to regain the control he had carried into the meeting, but it didn't settle the way it used to, because this time, control wasn't something he could assume. It was something he no longer held. And when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the certainty that had always defined it. He questioned the timing, the circumstances, suggested that there must be additional context that needed to be considered. But even as he said it, it was clear that he wasn't challenging the validity of the document, only searching for a way to slow down what he couldn't stop. No one supported him. The board members who would have once deferred to his authority remained quiet, not out of disrespect, but out of recognition. They had seen the same confirmation, heard the same legal validation, and whatever loyalty they had to him was now balanced against something more concrete, something that directly affected their roles, their responsibilities, and the structure of the company itself. And for the first time, my father was speaking into a room that was no longer aligned behind him. Vanessa tried to recover the narrative in a different way, shifting the focus away from the document and toward me, questioning my experience, my understanding of the business, implying that even if the shares were legally mine, that didn't translate into the ability to lead or influence decisions. And for a brief second, it almost worked, because it echoed everything that had always been said about me, everything that had been reinforced over the years. But this time, the room didn't respond the same way. The argument didn't carry the weight it once did, because the structure had already changed, authority had shifted, and her position, which had been built on assumption and expectation, no longer had the same foundation. What became visible in that moment wasn't just her frustration, but her dependence. The way her confidence had always been tied to the system that supported her, the expectations set by my father, the path that had been laid out for her, and without that certainty, without the guarantee of where she stood, there was a hesitation that hadn't been there before, a gap between what she was saying and how it was being received. The chairman brought the room back to order, his tone measured but firm, acknowledging the change in ownership and outlining what that meant procedurally. And then, almost seamlessly, the conversation moved to the next logical step. Leadership, not as a personal matter, but as a question of governance, of whether the current structure still served the best interests of the company given the new reality. And it was in that transition that the full impact of what had happened became clear. A motion was proposed, not by me, but by one of the board members, to initiate a vote of confidence in the current CEO, framed as a standard governance practice in light of significant ownership change. And once it was seconded, the process moved forward quickly. Each member asked to indicate their position, not based on history, not based on loyalty, but based on their assessment of what was best for the company moving forward. The votes were counted carefully, the room silent again, but this time the silence carried anticipation rather than shock. And when the final number was confirmed, the outcome was clear. The majority of the board no longer had confidence in my father's leadership, And according to the company's bylaws, that decision triggered a requirement he couldn't ignore. He would need to step down within 30 days. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or attempt to challenge the process, because there was nothing to challenge. The same system he had relied on for years had now turned against him, not unfairly, not unexpectedly, but as a direct result of the shift that had just taken place. And as he sat there, absorbing the outcome, the realization settled in, not just for him, but for everyone in the room. The position he had held for so long, the authority he had never questioned, was no longer his to keep. Vanessa said nothing. For the first time since I had known her, she had no immediate response, no strategy to redirect the situation, because the structure she had depended on had been removed in a single meeting, and what remained was something she hadn't prepared for, a reality where her position wasn't guaranteed, where her role had to be redefined without the support she had always assumed would be there. And as the meeting moved toward its conclusion, the shift was complete, not in a dramatic sense, not with raised voices or visible conflict, but in something quieter and far more final, the understanding that the balance of power had changed and that it wouldn't return to what it had been before. When the room settled after the vote, there was a brief pause where everyone seemed to be waiting for what I would do next, not because I had raised my voice or demanded anything, but because the position I now held came with an expectation, an assumption that I would use it immediately, decisively, maybe even aggressively. And I could feel that expectation in the way people looked at me, measuring, anticipating, trying to understand whether I would follow the same patterns they were used to seeing or something different. I stood slowly, not to take control of the room, but to be clear. And when I spoke, my voice carried without force, steady in a way that didn't require emphasis. "I'm not here to destroy this company," I said, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "I'm here to protect what it was meant to be." And for a moment, no one interrupted. No one challenged it, because the statement didn't invite conflict, it defined direction. I explained simply and directly that my intention wasn't to dismantle what had been built or to replace one form of control with another. The company had existed long before any of us were in that room, and it would continue long after, and whatever decisions were made moving forward needed to reflect that, needed to serve something larger than personal narratives or family dynamics. And I made it clear that I wasn't stepping into an operational role, that I wasn't there to run the company day to day, but I would be present where it mattered, where decisions shaped its future. My father didn't respond, not immediately, and when he finally looked at me, there was no argument in his expression, no attempt to regain ground. Just a quiet acknowledgement that whatever had existed between us before had shifted into something that couldn't be reversed by words alone, and I didn't try to bridge that gap, not in that moment, not in that room, because I understood that some things couldn't be resolved through a single conversation, especially not one that had been building for years. Vanessa held my gaze a little longer, as if searching for something, a sign that I would soften, that I would offer some reassurance or recognition of what had been lost for her as well. But I didn't, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity, because what she was losing wasn't something I had taken from her. It was something that had been built on assumptions that no longer held, and acknowledging that didn't require me to step back into the role I had spent my life trying to escape. As the meeting ended and people began to leave, the atmosphere shifted again, less tense now, more focused, conversations turning toward next steps, transition plans, the practical realities of what came after. And I remained where I was for a moment longer, not because I had anything left to say, but because I wanted to be certain that I wasn't reacting, that I wasn't making decisions based on what had just happened, but on what I knew needed to come next. When I finally walked out of the boardroom, I didn't stop to speak with my family, not because I was avoiding them, but because I didn't need to continue that conversation in the same way anymore. The boundaries had already been set. Not through confrontation, but through action. And for the first time, those boundaries felt real, not something I had to defend or explain, but something that simply existed. I moved forward, not away from them entirely, but no longer defined by them, carrying with me the understanding that distance wasn't rejection, it was space. Space to make decisions without being pulled back into the patterns that had shaped me before. Space to exist without constantly proving something. And as I stepped into that space, I realized that for the first time, I wasn't trying to find my place in the world they had built. I was deciding what my place would be on my own terms. For most of my life, I thought being chosen was something that happened to you. Something decided by the people with more power, more approval, more control over your future. I thought if I worked hard enough, stayed patient enough, proved myself in the right way, eventually someone would look at me and decide I was worth investing in, worth trusting, worth including. But standing there at the end of everything, I understood how wrong that was. Because no one was ever going to rewrite the story they had already decided about me, not my family, not the people in that company, not anyone who had benefited from seeing me a certain way. And the moment I stopped waiting for that change, the moment I stopped needing it, was the moment everything actually shifted. You don't need to be chosen, you need to choose yourself. And that choice doesn't always look dramatic or immediate. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it means stepping into situations you've spent years avoiding, but it's still a choice, one that no one else can make for you. And once you make it, once you act on it, it becomes something real, something that changes how the world responds to you. Not because the world suddenly becomes fair, but because you stop allowing it to define you in ways that no longer serve you. They paid me to stay invisible, to exist on the edges where I wouldn't disrupt anything, where I wouldn't challenge the roles that had already been assigned, and for a long time I accepted that. Not because I agreed with it, but because I didn't believe I had another option. But now, looking back, I can see exactly where that changed. Not in the moment I received the document, not even in the boardroom when everything shifted publicly, but in the decision I made before any of that, the decision to act, to step forward instead of staying where I had been placed, and because of that, everything that followed became possible. So I stopped waiting to be seen, and I built a life they couldn't ignore. If you were in my position, would you have removed your father immediately, or given him the same process I chose to follow? Would you choose justice even if it meant standing against your own family? Or would you protect the relationship at the cost of your own position? I want to know what you would do, because these choices don't have easy answers. They reveal what matters most to you. So tell me, would you cut it off completely or give them another chance? Comment yes if you would walk away, or no if you would try to rebuild something from what's left.